All right, so now we're in chapter 15, final stretch, last chapter of Griffin's book on human rights. And chapter 15, I've got two little videos on it, and these videos will deal with Griffin's discussion of group rights. And okay, so group rights, how do they fit into the general scheme of sort of the history of discussions of rights? Well, Griffin says that there was the first, second, and third generation, so group rights fit in the third generation of rights, which are more or less a very contemporary addition to the family of rights. So the first generation, like 17th, 18th century, those are your classical liberty rights, freedom of association, freedom of worship, liberty principles, things like that. So those are several hundred years old. The second generation is sometimes referred to as welfare rights and is often regarded as coming into force or around the mid 20th century. But of course, as we've seen earlier, that the notion of a welfare right, that is a claim to a good that a person will have, not just simply an internal good like an autonomy or a freedom of expression, but an external good like some kind of thing for a person's welfare, like food or water or things like that. That idea, you can find in the Middle Ages, where, as we saw earlier, where Griffin said, that it was an old medieval idea that that people in scarcity have a right to some goods from those who are in surplus, and that this was ultimately rooted in kind of a religious, metaphysical position about the distribution of the world and to God's creatures, namely us. But in any case, stripped of its theological backgrounds, it's often regarded as this kind of welfare right comes in the mid 20th century. So, and solidarity rights, group rights, things like that, those are fairly recent, last 35, 40 years or so. Anyways, that's probably not a perfectly accurate representation of history, but it gives sort of a bit of a taxonomy to orient your thoughts around. Now, group rights, what are we talking about here? Well, this is the basic idea is that a group is, like a people or a nation or a cultural group. These are possible rights bearers. Now, we're used to thinking of like individuals as rights bearers, but this is, kind of bringing in a mathematized notion of a set, where a set is like a many that can be thought of as a one. So you can think of a group of individuals as constituting a people, and that group has a right. And so that you can have rights bearers that are not just individuals but collections. And yeah, so those collections can be peoples, nations, cultural groups, etc., etc. But the key idea is that the right X is borne by the group Q, whatever, like if Q is a nation or a cultural group, that this is the whatever, it's the group that bears the right, and that the right that's born, this X, this right, whatever it happens to be, it's born by the actual group. And it's not that X is simply reducible to the rights of the members of the group. So there is a group right, and it belongs to the group as a totality. It's not something that you could just reduce down to the individuals. Now, you could say something like, well, a group has a right to exist, and so do its individuals. Fine. But there would be rights that the group has that are not reducible down or possessed by any of its members. Okay, so that's the key idea, right? That's what people are trying to drive home with a group right, is that it's something that's new on the scene that emerges, right? That it, maybe, philosophically speaking, maybe the individuals come first and then the group is formed, and then the group in its emergent form has a new kind of shall we say, it has a right that didn't exist prior in the individuals. Now, here's a typical argument against group rights that you often hear, and Griffin thinks you can dismiss this one pretty quickly. Anyways, you can see for yourself, evaluate for yourself whether or not you think this is a good argument or whether you think it should be something that is dismissed. In any case, look, an argument against group rights kind of goes like this. Look, groups act, groups, well, whatever they are, A group is not something that has agency. So if you take a bunch of agents, like a bunch of people that we have, that get together, so all the individuals are people. They each have agency. Okay, no problem. And they have rights because rights, you remember, human rights protect their agency. Okay, what are you talking about when you say that the group has rights? The group is not an agent, and any decision the group makes, you could reduce down to it's a product of, the individuals voted on it, they argue about it or whatever. The group doesn't have an intentional structure. And if you do say that it does, well, that's just another way of talking about the additive intentionalities of all the people that are in it. So like when the group makes a decision, it's not really the group making a decision. It's all the individuals that play the role in that process, and you can reduce the whole thing down to the actions of the individuals. So the group really, in the end, the group lacks agency. Human rights and rights and all that stuff and morality, that protects agency, right? That's all. That's the issue that it's all about, is agency. So there's really no such thing as a group right, because rights are based on deal with agency, and there's no such thing as group agency. So bang, there you go. Group rights are a fiction. Well, fine, Griffin says, but I don't think this, he says, this really doesn't work, because we have gone beyond. Now, this is sort of a conventional, like, it is done kind of argument. It's a done deal. As they like to say in jurisprudence, it's settled law. Well, is it settled opinion that non-agents can have rights? I mean, a number of years ago, we would have thought it odd, not necessarily us today, but, several years ago, maybe like 40, 50 years ago, when Peter Singer, for instance, was writing about the rights of animals, that was greeted as odd. And some people even today don't think animals, non-human animals, that is, have rights. That the rights, let's say, that my dog has really are reducible down to my rights that the dog has in virtue of being my dog, something like that. So there are cases where we would clearly say, yeah, we do talk about rights of non-humans. But then, you could bring the agent argument in and say, well, actually, it's an irreducible, a dog has an irreducible right because a dog is a kind of agent. So you're still operating within the discourse of rights and agency. But rights are often extended to non-agents, like trees, like a rainforest. Like we don't find it strange to talk about rights for non-agents. So it might have been odd before, but it could be debatable, it could be wrong, but the point is that it's not totally alien and irrational or whatever. You can make the case for rights bearers being non-agents. So the domain of agency does not exhaust the domain of rights bearers. So if you like to think of it in kind of a Venn diagram, we've accepted that the big circle of rights bearers is bigger than the circle of agents. So but then again, people start arguing that trees have interests, right, and et cetera, et cetera. So maybe there's another kind of agency involved or whatnot. But in any case, Griffin just doesn't think that this argument's going to really work, because rights are not just all about agency. Now, just because an argument in favor of group rights just because an argument against group rights fails, sorry about that. So because an argument against group right fails, that doesn't mean that group rights are saved. And yes, I countered an argument that you gave me against group rights, therefore I win. No, I just, as Griffin says, well, you just managed to knock off one argument that's a bad argument against group rights, but a bad argument that gets knocked to the side doesn't mean that you've come up with a good argument for group rights. So, why would you what are some good arguments for group rights, or at least better ones, so that we could say we've got an argument for it rather than just countering arguments against it? Well, think about it. Why does some S, whatever S is, have rights? Well, we value agency, so typically we do. Yeah, Griffin says, yeah, there's no question that rights and agency are connected. Of course, he's built a whole book on that idea. But we value agency because it is a good. So this is an argument, a good-based argument for rights. So we value agency not in just simply because of agency, but because we think it's a good, right? So maybe that's what we could look at. If it's a good that we want to protect, well, then S has rights because it S possesses some good, namely an agency. We value agency. S possesses this agency, so that's a good we want to protect. So, okay, S is a rights bearer. How about that? So it's a good, a possession of a good that we want to protect the possessor of it. Well, are there goods that are, quote unquote, possessed or predicates that adhere to groups? And those predicates are valuable and we want to protect them. Can we get something like that off the ground? So this is a good-based argument for a group right. He thinks that there are two arguments. One is the good-based argument and one is the justice-based. Justice-based I'll leave for the next video. The good-based argument is, kind of flowing out of this little discussion here, that the good-based is that there's an emergent good that is possessed by the group alone, right? And this emergent good is something that comes out when you have a group being constituted. So you get something new in the world, right? That's always a controversial metaphysical claim, but nonetheless, you have properties that are new and they emerge in the world. So if you really are thinking about group rights and these rights adhere to collectivities and they're not simply reducible to individuals within those collectivities, then you're pretty well forced into saying something like there's something new in the world when collectivities emerge, right? Something new emerges alongside properties of those collectivities. They're a good, and we would say not reducible. What would be an example of this kind of collective, not a collective good like a public good in the sense of fresh air or whatever. That's kind of what the economists call public goods. But what is, because a public good is good for the public, but it's good for the individuals, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not necessarily a predicate of the public. What's a predicate of a public or a group or a nation or a cultural group that's valuable that we want to protect? That's what we're talking about. Now, just to get an idea of this kind of good that emerges and is a possession of a collectivity, think about something very simple, and I'm using Griffin's example, of conviviality. You go to a dinner party and afterwards you say, that was a great party. And it was great. Why? Well, it was just and we have terms that we use, like, well, it was a great atmosphere, it was a great conversation. But what you're talking about is a property of the event, of the group, right? And we often say this, like, that was a really good group. We got together, this is a fun group. I like going out for supper with this group. And it's not any particular person in the group when you say great group or was very convivial, it can't reduce it down to the individuals, because it's not the same experience that you have if you go out with them separately or whatnot. It's the group kind of notion. Now, yes, the experience of the group is the group may not have an internal structure that's akin to an agent. Like, there's no group mind, and I mean, sometimes we say hive mind or whatever, but really there's no group sort of mind in the way that there are individual minds in that group. Nonetheless, there's a kind of predicate which we will call conviviality that applies and is held by the group. It's not reducible down to any of them. So there you go. There's a kind of good. So can you have, like, that was kind of a fun sort of predicate. But Griffin asked, can you have more moral predicates? Like fraternity and solidarity, and this is a predicate of the group. And so can we get an argument for group rights out of this? And Griffin, he discusses some other thinkers on the notion of moving from a group good to a group right? There's a kind of group good, but getting from that to a group right, he thinks that these kinds of arguments ultimately fail. And they tend, once they're really heavily scrutinized, they tend to break down into versions or variations of the first and second, but especially the first of these classical liberty rights. So ultimately, he thinks that these arguments from the good of a group, like that it possesses some kind of emergent good, ultimately really are just versions of rights that we've seen that accrue to individuals. So he thinks that this doesn't really work all that well, and that you can, it's not really adding anything new. That doesn't mean he doesn't say that groups are important. Remember, Griffin never says that rights, human rights, and all that's completely occupies the entire space of moral importance. Groups can be extremely important. All kinds of things about them can be important, but that's different. That doesn't necessarily lead us to say that groups have rights. Okay, so that's one of the versions about one of the arguments for group rights is this good-based argument. He doesn't think that one really works. The second one is the justice-based, and we'll look at that in the next video.